Hey friends, you're watching BrainStormAcres. I'm Henry, and we need to talk about poop. Poo. You know the words, but we need to talk. Of all the questions that we get asked about homesteading in rural America, probably the most touchy one is when you're building your own place, what do you use with toilet water? Your poo. The poops. There's a lot of ways of getting rid of it. Some of them are more ecologically sound than others. But which one you can use depends a lot on where you live. Now there's a bunch of different ways. You can use an outhouse many places, but not everywhere. And some places have very specific rules about how you construct that outhouse. You can use a septic system, but every municipality, every location has rules about how you build and where you build a septic system. You could use a composting toilet. There's about half of the states in the U.S. that allow you to use a composting toilet. The hitch is that you may need a NSF registered composting toilet. It's expensive, not as expensive as a drain field for a septic system, but it's still expensive, it's bulky, and you have very specific rules about how you handle the stuff that's being composted. Probably the most controversial of all the ways of handling human excrement, poos, poop, all that stuff, is using Humanure. Humanure has been practiced for more than 1,000 years in parts of Asia. It's euphemistically called night soil. It's collected in many parts of China, for example, and it's composted more or less, a lot of times less, to use as fertilizer in various fields like rice paddies. And the problem with that is pretty simple. You get ducks and pigs and people stuff all in the water, and that becomes a great breeding ground for new viruses. Who'd have thought? But that's where a lot of viruses come from. Well, let's suppose you have a composting toilet. Can you just dump that out and use it as compost? Well, in most of the U.S. you can't. A lot of places have rules about how long material has to compost before you can use it. Typically 120 days or something like that. And it has to be composted at higher temperatures. You need to make sure that it's above 160 degrees. That's in order to kill pathogens. So the idea is to protect your health and the people's health around you. Now, why can't you just dump raw sewage on the ground? Well, I suppose some places you might be able to get away with it. But imagine if you live halfway down a hill and you have a neighbor on top of the hill, and that neighbor decides to just run a straight pipe from their sewer line to downslope from their house. Well, when it rains, what happens? All that stuff comes down the hill. Now, a lot of this has to do with how sanitary can it be. Now, most places say, no, you can't just dump raw sewage on the ground. Well, you also can't just dump the materials from a composting toilet onto the ground. Most places. If you look at all of the United States various agencies, whether it's the National Forest Service, the National Parks, Bureau of Land Management, all of them have prohibitions about dumping any kind of human waste, whether it's composted or not, onto the surface. Well, I suppose you could say, well, I'm going to be clever and I'm going to bury it. Maybe. So that brings up a really good question. There's an awful lot of people who say the county can't regulate this, the county can't regulate that, my city can't regulate this, and my city can't regulate that. Well, that may all well be true if you have enough money. And what do I mean by enough money? Well, pretty much governmental agencies have an unending supply of cash to pay attorneys. Most of us can't afford the thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars and years of being in court trying to argue with some governmental agency. If you want to, go at it. But don't be surprised if you lose, because a lot of these regulations do have a greater purpose in terms of protecting health. So let's go on to Humanure. It's a great theory. It's a fantastic resource if you can compost it right. And the idea is that you carry your waste from your house with no treatment and you put it into a compost pile. That compost pile is typically built with straw bales, and the materials put into the middle and straw put over the top of it. So it will compost most places most of the time. But here in the desert Southwest, composting is very, very slow, and more importantly, we don't generally have enough water to make sure that it stays wet enough so the compost can go to that 160-degree temperature that's required to safely get rid of the pathogens that can cause you, your family, your friends, other people health problems. Well, let's talk about whether or not Humanure is legal. You know, this is one of those things that I'm not a lawyer. I'm going to give you my experience and tell you how people behave. Not how laws behave, it's how people behave. The number one reason why homesteaders or people who are trying to do alternative building or alternative sewage disposal get into problems is a neighbor. You don't want to be ticking off your neighbor, because that's the person who's going to contact the health authorities and come rain on your parade. Well, how much can they rain? Well, most of the U.S. does not have regulations that specifically say that composting of human waste products is permitted under their laws, under their regulations, whatever you want to call it. They don't specifically say that's okay to do. There's a problem with that. In the area that we live in, we're allowed to build an outhouse. There's very specific rules. You build the outhouse and you can use it and life is good. But what about Humanure? Well, it's composting, right? Yeah, kind of is, and it is. I'm not going to argue that. But it is above ground. It's not contained. Okay, maybe it's contained in straw, but let's take somebody who lives in another part of Arizona where you get massive water flood sheeting across their property. Well, if they have their compost pile that's not raised up off the surface, they very well could be passing on all that stuff that's not fully composted to their friends downstream. How far downstream? Miles. Sometimes many miles. Did I consider using Humanure here? I sure did. It's very simple. It's a great source of organic matter to build your soil. There's problems with it, but I considered it. Did you know that in some parts of the United States, it's legal to use a composting toilet, but it's illegal to move that product off your own physical property or to allow it to go off your properties? That means you can't let rain go off your property if it's going through that waste product, even though it's composted. There's a fine line. It's maybe not so fine, but there is a line between that which is permitted, that is, the code says you're allowed to do it, the code that says you're not allowed to do it, and the stuff that's not defined in the middle. Humanure, most parts of the country, is not defined. It's neither allowed nor not allowed. And the problem with that is that it leaves it up to the people who are the bureaucrats in your area. That means that one day James might get up on the wrong side of the bed and say, I'm not going to allow that person to use Humanure. Why? No, I don't think it's a good thing to do. What are you going to do? Well, I can tell you, you're either going to clean it up or you're going to go to court. From my position, fighting with the authorities who have the ability to levy fines, red tag your house, that is, say that it's not fit for human use, so that they can have you evicted off your own property. Taking those risks are not a good risk. There's other things to take risks on. It's easier to go along and get along when it comes to a lot of these rules. Can you get away with Humanure? Sure. Some places, some time. All the time? Probably not. One of the things you need to be really concerned about is how fast is your area changing. That means how many more people are coming in. The more people you have come in from outside of rural America, the more likely you to have changes in the zoning rules and land use regulations and all those things that complicate life for everybody, yet at the same time simplify life. So just count on change happening. What happens then? Well, all of a sudden you may find that perfectly permitted approach is no longer permitted. That's fine. You may still be able to sell your place, but chances are very good you're going to have to carry the paper on it. That is, you're going to have to be the mortgage holder. So you're not going to get all your money out right away. It's going to be over time. A lot of banks won't lend for alternative building practices unless they're specifically built into the building code in your area. Well, the same goes for septic. Unless it's built into the code, it's not going to be something that most lenders are going to be willing to lend money on. Well, I hope this was of some interest to you and that I helped provide some new perspective or different perspectives on using alternative waste management techniques. There's a lot more to this that I'll cover in future shows. One of the things that you can do to help us here on our homestead is share and like and follow our channel. But we also have affiliate links in our descriptions that tell you about products that we use on our homestead every day. If you're going to go ahead and buy something, please consider using one of our affiliate links. There's no charge to you for using it. Instead, we get a small commission back from whoever is providing that link. Thanks for watching. We'll talk with you later. And don't forget to brainstorm. It's really important.